Aoife, a deep, guttural voice shouted, cutting through the carnage of the battle, cutting off at the edge as the blade from a warrior's heavy sword was thrust into his chest, setting the man falling to his knees. The thick, sickening stench of blood twisted and danced merrily through the blood-soaked wet field. The red life essence of every dead man, woman and child shed like toxic liquid into the Shannon. Its usual crystal clear, shimmering blue water was lost to a crimson glow. Still through the misery and decay of a once vibrant array of armed soldiers, all with their brisk, burly Irish brogue, lay scattered on the ground as their murderers continued their slaughter. The castle grew closer to their beady, predatory eyes, the thick red blood running easily from their blades, and the sun shining in the sky, like an unwilling witness to their carnage, led their way. With the castle's lord and heirs scattered amongst the debris of warriors, their bodies were torn up and scarred. Their demise was felt in the morale of the remaining troops. Aoife bit back a growl, her watery, emerald green eyes watching as they drew nearer. She'd wanted a way to get out of her marriage to Seamus Fitzgerald, the nephew of the Earl of Desmond. This really had not been on her list. She'd prayed for his elopement, his sudden realization that she could definitely do better than a drunken slob, or to finally grow the courage to announce she wanted no man. A momentary flicker of a petite redhead, whose pale features lit up two orbs of perfect sea blue eyes, freckles lightly dusted evenly across both cheeks. Niamh. When the Earl of Desmond had begun his rebellion against the English crown and their oppressive rule, her father had joined him, believing they should keep their land out of the hands of the English monarch. As a result, in the pact, she had become engaged to the Earl's nephew, Seamus. In respect, her father had said, given to the fact that the Earl had no legitimate heirs, and Seamus was his closest legal heir, she would become the Countess of Desmond, he had proudly proclaimed to all. Aoife had not been so taken with the idea. In fact, she'd voiced her disapproval loud and clear, but even her father, who had given her far too much freedom as a woman, according to the men all around them, even he wouldn't take into account his daughter's words. Now she was left alone to fight and push back the enemy. Seamus had fled, and her father and brothers were all dead. She'd just watched her father fall, his voice still echoing in her ears. "Draw back," she shouted as loud as her throat would allow. "We can't fight the bastards unless we're in unison." The members of the Drugain clan watched her, a fierce flame alighting her eyes, but it was clear. After today, she was the last Drugain left. They'd just seen their chieftain and his 5 heirs all fall at the blades of English invaders, all intent on taking what was theirs. Each grizzled, war-torn man nodded, their heads bowed. The woman was right, even if they wished not to admit it out loud. Yet doing as a woman said cut them, maybe even more so than a sword would do. They were men. Aoife felt her blood rage. This is my family's castle, my family's land. We've been here since the time of Niall, and I'll be damned if I'll let them take it from us. She pulled the vast great sword her father had given her. The only daughter of 6, she'd been often treated like her brothers. Now they were gone. So sit here and fall where your stubborn wee asses are glued with shame for having not listened to a woman, or fight and die, for it's better to die on your feet with fire in your heart than curl up and die. Her once pale features turned blood red with effort, her heart pumping harshly within her chest, so much she feared it would break out and escape her. Shouts raised up around her. With shaking hands she raised her sword. The loud battering of wood and harsh English shouts called out to them. The enemy was in the castle, and this was it. They were about to meet their fate. For my father and my brothers, who died as heroes, pray we all live to tell their stories, she cried out, her sword pointed up high, before turning and running through the door. In the rugged stone hallway, the sounds of the invaders grew louder. Her heart fluttered. Her mother's words from her childhood drifted in her mind. Remember, Aoife, to be afraid does not mean you are not scared. It had been too long since she had heard her sweet lullabies. His appearance startled her. A cracked face of wrinkles and a beard made him look old and dishevelled. The English armour told her this was it. Hey, what do we have here then? I'll tell you what, why don't you and I have a little fun? He leered at her, his eyes trained on the cleavage of her modestly slim-fitting black dress. Aoife struggled not to empty the contents of her stomach. Not in this lifetime. I'd rather throw myself from the battlements. You've got no choice. He lunged forward, his massive bulky frame hurtling towards her like a wild animal set to catch its prey. Aoife waited, her heart in her throat. A small bead of sweat ran down the palm of her hand. He reached out to grab her. Leaning sideways, moving out of his reach, she raised her sword in the air with one hand, the meager muscles in her arm flexing and twitching with the effort. With a sudden clash of her arm, she sliced it into his shoulder. He let out a feral cry of pain, hissing, clenching at his wound as Aoife, moving her long raven black hair from her eyes, where it had fallen, standing over him, blood specks over her porcelain cheeks, like an executioner standing over her victim. For my father. Bitch, he hissed, struggling to his feet. His feet slipping as Aoife plunged the sword into his chest, twisting it with such force it appeared at the other side of him. I don't like that word. Turning swiftly on her heels, she paced with purpose further down the hallway, blood lust filling her, revenge in her heart. She yearned for her next victim so she could ease her pain. Through the door she walked, a vague memory of her mother telling her tales of ghosts and spirits that followed the living through doorways. As a child she'd been afraid, refused to walk through doors for a while. And now she imagined the fallen warriors of Drugain behind her, their fierce pride and brute strength flowing through her. She would beat the English and rebuild the castle. Another English soldier appeared like a ghost from the mist of the sunlight reflected through the castle window, a nasty scowl on his face. She didn't stop. She sped up, running until their swords clashed, sending out a loud echo through the narrow ancient hall. The effect vibrated violently up her arm, too close to him. Before he could react, she lifted her leg and kicked him hard as he clenched at the pain in his private region. Aoife sent the sword home into his side, pulling it out heartlessly and swiftly moving on. Every man she met, she slew. People talked about women being weak. She heard it every week in church. It made her long for the days before her ancestors had left paganism. But given a vengeful and grieved heart, they could accomplish anything. She drove the army back through the castle gates, past the sea of dead, faithful Drugain warriors, saw the dead face of her father, his green eyes staring her way, as though in death he watched her, as he had done in life. She knew his one eye was different to the other. She'd inherited that too. Pushing aside the thought she couldn't succumb to her grief now, that was for later. When every last of the English spoilers were dead or retreated, Aoife stood by the side of the Shannon, her place of choice for childhood play. 25 years had passed, but still she could see her brothers and she as they run and play. She threw her sword down in the grass and let despair take over. The tears rolled down her cheeks. Her eyes suddenly grew wide and she let out a pained gasp, just barely catching her breath. Falling to her knees, the unbearable pain in her back made it hard to breathe. Her vision began to blur as blood began pouring from her mouth. In front of her then stood her attacker. He was not an enemy. She'd known him since her birth. He'd been the one to cast the holy water over her head. Now he stood over her, a sympathetic smile on his face as he touched her chin gently. Shush now, child. The end will come. I'm helping you. It's not a woman's place to fix this mess and rule over men. The light began to dim as the blood choked her. She fell backward onto the grass beside the water she'd loved so much. Her long black hair fanned out around her head like a dark halo of a fallen angel. Her fight had been futile, for she was slain by a friend and not a foe. Not one Drugain was left alive. Aoife opened her eyes slowly. The memory of a deep, bone-clenching pain was gone. Yet as she looked around, she found herself in a wooden box. Open, she could see the familiar stone structure of the church. She blinked hard. But I died. I know I did. There was nothing, just blackness. I felt my heart stop. Footsteps echoed around her. She remained silent. Come now, little one. I know you are awake. It's just me. There is no one to be afraid. An unfamiliar voice called sweetly. It was motherly. It was warm. Aoife wanted to listen, but caution called to her instead. Who are you? She called out. Such a beautiful Irish melody in your voice. I think, child, that you and I will work together very well. A slender hand appeared, beckoning her to take it. Cautiously and shyly, Aoife reached her own hand out and touched the soft skin of the unknown woman. That's it, little one. Slowly she pulled her up. Aoife Drugain, the last of the proud ancient Drugain clan, found herself sitting up in her own coffin. A memory hit her. One of her own death. The priest. Dear child, your eyes speak of revenge. I can give it to you, if you help me. Brown eyes smiled warmly, yet a hidden menace lurked within. Aoife could feel an energy. She placed her hand over her heart. There was nothing. The woman smiled. Common affliction, my dear. But the heart is very overrated, don't you think? How am I alive? Aoife whispered. Simple answer is that you aren't. Not anymore. The happier news is that you will remain your beautiful self forever. Isn't that wonderful? People should appreciate beauty more. She traced her fingertip lightly across Aoife's cut glass jawline, her observant eyes piercing into Aoife's. Who are you? Unsure of the news, she questioned more. I'm your mother now. I had a mother. Aoife frowned. Yes. But she is dead and gone, and I gave you eternal youth and beauty, and the chance to get your revenge. It's yours if you want it. Do you want it, Aoife? She watched her eyes becoming glued to the sitting woman, waiting for the inevitable to happen. It always did. No one ever said no. In truth, no one ever had the chance to. Visions of revenge coiled in her stomach like a violent bug. What do I have to do? The woman smiled, leaning forward to help her out of the box. Let Mother take care of you now. Everything will be okay now. The music roared loudly, the orchestra played vividly, enchanting tunes of romance and mystery. On the dance floor, couples twirled and pirouetted in circles. The stench of wealth was everywhere. The city's elite had come out in force. Even royalty had been spotted, flittering in and out of the crowd. It was the usual stuffy celebration, held for no reason at all, just for one family to show how much wealth they had. Tomorrow night there would be another, and then another. It continued. People thought battles were held on fields with soldiers. They were wrong. They took place in grand, huge houses, gold hanging from the ceilings, and expensive champagne was drunk as though it were water. It was a world away from Drugain Castle, from her childhood home in Kerry. Everything was new. At night she would dream of the Shannon, a swimming in the deep, shadowy plains of its ethereal liquid majesty, and battling her brothers on the banks, Patrick would win, mostly. He was the eldest, their father claimed, when the rest would come to him sulking that they had lost again. Aoife rolled her eyes, bored of the usual routine. Night after night, the same play, the same script. She'd been tired for 100 years, but loyalty to her mother stopped her from fleeing. Anything the heavy ball gown stopped her from moving very fast. The usual boring trope, Matska sighed, drinking from her crystal glass of champagne. Aoife nodded her head in agreement, her eyes fixed on a familiar figure across the room. It seems dear Carmilla has come up trumps again. Oh, Mama will be pleased, her sister laughed. And you, who have you picked? Aoife felt the now familiar growing discontent. You know me, sister, I like to take my time. We both know Carmilla is mother's favorite. It's not as though we have to worry about this. True. Matska turned towards her with a wicked smile across her lips. I've seen you, though, casting your little emerald eyes on the Archduchess. Aoife shrugged. Anyone with a title and a writ should be fair game. They're all human and are all despicable. She'd watched her country fall little by little to the evil grasp of English rule, saw her ancient family's lands running with the blood of the families who had lived there under the Drugain protection for generations upon generations. As the invader stole their prized green fields and heavenly trees as their own, ruling with an iron fist, her only satisfaction had been devouring the priest who'd taken her life. She'd smirked, remembering his face when he'd seen her. It was one she had never forgotten. The confusion had given way to fear, especially when she'd borne her fangs. His cry had filled the whole valley. Indeed, slightly less grotesque than the poor, too. Look, here she comes. Mattie pointed, her glass still in her hand, as their sister walked towards them. She asked me the other day if I ever questioned what we do. Aoife listened intently. She wasn't the only one who thought this. How had she not known this before? What did you say? Mattie shrugged. Nothing, of course. Of course. Aoife sighed. You don't question it, do you? Her sister asked. What? Oh, goodness, no, of course not. Mother knows best. As she said it, Aoife felt another part of her dead heart die further. The sister drew nearer, a shy smile across her thin lips. Lost in her own little world, her gaze held downward. She still managed to carefully avoid bumping into people, just like a ballerina, carefully gliding across a stage with careful, gentle elegance. How does she do that? Matska shook her head, an indulgent smile on her face. I'll go and top us up. Good idea, although I think she's had enough. Aoife laughed. What? Carmilla questioned as Matska turned away. Aoife saw it, even if no one else could. That same wanderlust she'd noticed ever since she'd met her latest mark. An ominous feeling grew louder in her core, until that was all she could feel screaming at her to take notice. Don't do what it is you are thinking about, Carmilla. The shorter woman startled, flustered. What do you mean? I'm not thinking about anything. I've known you for nearly 200 years. You don't think I haven't gotten a little insight into you by now? Carmilla knew, at that moment, if her face could turn red, it would. This was the moment she thanked the heavens she was already dead. You are imagining things. Aoife moved closer. Carmilla, be careful. Mother, she knows everything we do. Even when we hide it, she knows it. And she always finds a way to better us. Good thing I'm not hiding anything then, isn't it? Carmilla shrugged. Aoife felt eyes on them, not the ones she usually feared, not their mother. She wasn't here tonight. Lifting her gaze, she met the gaze of the young woman her sister had chosen, and who she knew, despite her denials, she was smitten with. Maybe it was even more than that. At that moment, that brief touch of eyes through a crowded ballroom, Aoife was drawn back to the first woman she'd ever loved, Niamh. There was an innocence in the depth of this girl's murky green eyes. The memory of standing at the back of the church when she'd watched Niamh marry Seamus, how ironic that had been. And every now and then, she had given in to the urge to torture herself and go back to catch just a glimpse of her. The last time she'd found herself standing beside a grave, killed by English troops during a siege. Aoife had spent a decade avenging her death. Her brutal murder, all her mind could conjure up, was Niamh's sweet smile. Suddenly, she grabbed her sister's arm and pulled her into an alcove, away from prying eyes and gossiping mothers. "Be careful and listen to my warning, Carmilla. You must know she will not tolerate betrayal, and you take care. Do you think a human really could ever love someone like us? What the hell is there to love?" Carmilla pulled her arm from Aoife's iron grip. "What I do is none of your business. It's too late to stop whatever has started." "She always gets her way," Aoife warned. She'd seen what happened when someone betrayed their mother. It had taught her that was something she never wanted to happen to her. Her sister didn't reply. The sullen, rebellious, hate-filled stare she sent her as she turned away told her everything she needed to know. Dread and fear filled her. Her hands shook as she raised it and ran it over her brow. Her hands never shook. "Now, Carmilla, what have you done?"